We may not have been very active in the recent past in getting our message across. We've been doing really great research, but I'm really happy to have the opportunity to be here to beat the drum for root lesion nematode in general, and Pratylenchus teres, which is a West Australian issue in particular. So our projects are supported by DAFWA and by GRDC. And of course, I have to particularly thank the growers who allow us to do work on their properties. So really, root lesion nematode, the numbers should speak for themselves. It's in 60% of our paddocks across our cropping area, and it's yield limiting in 40% of those paddocks. When you look at this map, we've been working on developing a database map with Art Diggle's group. Just take this distribution as more of the picture I'm trying to build here, not the actual numbers. We're working backwards, and we are now putting together all of our past history for root lesion nematode research and our surveys in the past. So as you can see, it's distributed very widely across our cropping zone. The way I see root lesion nematode is, and its affecting paddocks, is really in 3 layers. So at the bottom layer, you have the paddocks, these 40% of paddocks where it is yield limiting. Nematodes are really cryptic, so you might not actually realise that it's affecting the profitability in your paddock. It's probably ticking along at a certain level where you're probably maybe getting 5 to 10% yield loss. So when we're talking about optimising cropping systems, this is really an issue that does impact on getting the optimal profitability from your paddocks. The next layer, as I see it, is the people who realise they have a problem with RLN, and they are dealing with it already through their rotations and their variety selections. And then I get to what I would call the holy crap paddocks. These are the ones where growers may have inadvertently been increasing their nematode numbers. They may have been sitting at a certain level where they weren't recognising it in their crop. And then the moons align, the seasons align, and they actually move into a position where they have a really significant crop loss on a paddock. And when this happens, when your nematode levels get to this point, it doesn't take one season to bring them back down in many cases. Then it's really an effort to bring it back down to a level where you can manage it to a more profitable level. We had a number of holy crap circumstances in 2012. It seemed to be a very good year for Pratylenchus teres in particular. And they were growers who I was in contact with from areas like the Narrogin area, Arthur River and Esperance. So when we look at that 60% of paddocks, what do we have? Pratylenchus neglectus is our major problem in Western Australia. This is a nematode of national significance, as is Pratylenchus thornii. Nationally, thornii is a big problem. Luckily in Western Australia, that's one that we can say is less of an issue. A lot of work has been done, as it should have been done across the country, on neglectus and thornii. And I have to say that the programs that we're running in Western Australia, we're not running them in isolation. I have really good support, and we do a lot of collaboration with the groups that are doing research in the other areas. So then we get to Pratylenchus teres. Now, teres is an issue only in Western Australia. And although you may be looking at that and saying 15%, this is an important 15% because from what we can see, teres, when it is a problem, may be a far greater problem in your paddock than some of the other root lesions that you might be finding. Now, this information is actually built on our surveys that were done in the early 2000s to the end of the 1990s, when root lesion nematode really became known as an issue in Western Australia. In the last couple of years, we've had the really good Focus Paddock initiative, and we've been able to utilise that information to build our picture for root lesion nematode again. Now, really, this just supports what we already found and what we already thought about root lesion nematode. Are the numbers creeping when we look at 60% to 65? Maybe not, maybe. Now, I realise when we talk about the breakdown here, I did this as a quick back of the envelope thing, and it adds up to more than 100%. And that's because I haven't taken the time to differentiate out the single nematode paddocks from the mixed populations. But as you can see from this, Neglectus is all over the place. And teres is probably in more paddocks than we thought. So why should you care? The reason that you should care, as we talked about, is the profitability on your paddock. You need to realise that these nematodes, root lesion nematode, have a really wide host range. They cannot be controlled at this stage by nematicides. When the conditions are suitable, their numbers can increase significantly in a season and become yield limiting very quickly. So you cannot control your nematodes, but you may very well manage them in your paddock or on your property to your advantage. And as I said before, if your numbers get high, you're dealing with more than just a one-season issue. So what is it and where is it? We think in Western Australia that root lesion nematodes concentrated in our top 15%. I say this because in the other side of the country, particularly with thorny eye, they actually get thorny eye moving within a metre. But they have, this is Queensland mainly, on the northern agricultural zone, where they have much more moisture within their profile. We think that in Western Australia it probably sits around the root zone. It has this wonderful ability, I say that as an nematologist, I'm sure you won't agree, of anhydrobiosis. And this means it's able to dehydrate and survive over the summer period. I don't know if any of you have got children, but my kids had sea monkeys at one stage. And it's that kind of thing where it dehydrates, you add water, it comes alive, and it's ready for the next season to invade the roots and cause issues. Pratylenchus is an endoparasitic nematode, and this means that it actually lives its life by going into the roots. You can see in red on this picture is actually nematodes inside and outside the root structure itself. So the nematode will pierce the root. This in itself causes damage to the root system, as you can imagine. Then it actually will move into the root, and it will use this stylet or spear to actually puncture cells and take its nutrition from the cells themselves. The nematodes can live within the plant, they can lay their eggs within the plant, but they also importantly have the ability to leave that plant root when they feel like it to go on to better pastures, if you like. Crop symptoms. Nematodes are really cryptic, and this is one of the reasons I think it sits in 60% of our paddocks, and in a lot of cases without people really realising that they may have an issue. It may sit in your paddock as just something that looks wavy or uneven. If you get to this level where you can actually see little holes or patches in your paddock, you're already at a decent level of yield loss. Often nematodes are the last thing that people think about. They're looking at nutrition, they're looking at maybe that gravelly patch in your paddock that just every now and again doesn't work well. So there's all sorts of other things. I think also other plant diseases like rhizoctonia probably get the knock on the head as being an issue before root lesion nematode does. And the two do often go hand in hand. So once you get patches, then obviously you know that there's more a significant problem. And these patches may be really significant in one year, the next year they may be less. The season may be different and you may not see them again, and you can put it down to something else again. Unfortunately, in some circumstances, you have those holy crap paddocks where an entire paddock becomes chlorotic and stunted, and you are looking at really significant yield loss in that season. So increasing your prats, how is it happening? Obviously susceptible crops, we know this. When you do that in succession, that opens you up to all sorts of issues in a number of areas. The other things I have here, I've got question marks next to, because these are the things that we make a presumption on based on our knowledge of other nematodes. Now I must remind you again, Pratylenchus teres that I'm talking about today is one that we haven't done very much research on at all. So these are suppositions that might not be true, and we really have to learn much more about this nematode before we can say these things with certainty. So we do think across the board that soil disturbance is important for reducing your numbers, because, as I talked about before, anhydropogosis means that you have a dried out nematode sitting in your soil over the summer months. In that state, they can be easily smashed up when you're moving the soil around. I've got lots of question marks next to below average rainfall, because the nematode I'm going to concentrate today, we are wondering if it likes more rain, and it's the wetter seasons that actually give it the ability to cause the most damage. Volunteer hosts and weeds, of course they're an issue. As far as teres is concerned, we're not really sure which ones it's going to be particularly good at growing on. Early sowing. Early sowing might give the nematode an increased ability to multiply throughout a season. It gives it more time to increase its numbers and impact on your plant. But that one again, we're not completely sure with teres. So crop losses caused by RLN. These figures are quite rubbery, and it will of course depend on the season that you have. For for Neglectus and thornii, you may be looking at, in a bad situation, between 10 and 30%. Across the board, you're looking at an average of 5%. I mean, this is real money. 5% yield decreases, as you know, is real money across the board. But they are variable. Nematodes are always variable. They're a difficult critter to deal with, and that will depend on what nematode levels you start with, what species you're dealing with, what your rotation's been, what your crop tolerance and variety selections are, and what the season's like. So here, why should you care which species you have? If you actually get to the point where you know you've got RLN in your paddock, you think that you're going to manage it in certain ways. I have to say here that some people might fall into the trap of making rotational choices or varietal choices based on the general knowledge of Pratylenchus neglectus. Now you need to, if you have a mixed population paddock, which most of our paddocks are, you may make choices in your paddock to bring down the numbers of neglectus and in actual fact increase your numbers of teres. And teres may actually be a worse critter than neglectus ever was in your paddock, in your situation. The symptoms are identical. If you bother to pull out the roots and look at the symptoms of root lesion nematode, you are not going to tell the difference between any of the root lesions that I've talked about. But what they like to eat does differ. They do have a really wide host range, so you really need to account for them with everything that you're choosing to put onto the paddocks that you're using. And again, remember, we don't have nematicide control in broadacre situations at this stage, so you have to manage them. When we look at the hosts, as you can see, we can, with all the really good research that we've done over the years on neglectus, we can build quite a decent picture for neglectus on what the hosts are and what their levels of susceptibility are. Our job here still isn't done, by the way. I saw in Mark Sweetingham's talk, he talked about acid soils. Acid soils obviously are an issue in Western Australia, and we've just done some research last year with Chris Gazy, looking at the fact that resistance levels for against Pratylenchus neglectus decline significantly with acid soils. So higher pH soils maintain the resistance, lower pH soils actually reduces the resistance of the varieties of, that we looked at to root lesion nematode. As you can see, when we talk about hosts for teres, we do have some ideas, but we've really got a lot more work to do to fill in this with certainty, where what things Pratylenchus what things are susceptible to Pratylenchus teres. So now looking at teres in particular, if you remember back to the first slide I showed where I looked at the distribution of Pratylenchus in general across the state, you'll see that this is quite different. Now, well, number one, this might be different because we haven't done enough yet to know exactly where it is. Or it could be, as we're thinking, that it might actually like the higher rainfall zones. The numbers that you see here again, we are building this picture and we are delving back through our research to fill in our database to its greatest point. So this is more a map of distribution rather than of numbers. So when the research began in the early 90s to mid-90s, we actually thought that Pratylenchus teres was Pratylenchus thornii, which is the same creature that they're dealing with in the eastern states. So it wasn't until 2001 that they actually published a paper which said, hey, we've actually got a Western Australian issue here. In the time since then, most work in Western Australia has concentrated, the lion's share has concentrated on Neglectus, as it should. It is in most of our paddocks. But the picture hasn't been developed for teres, so that's what we've been working on. I'm just going to point out, as I said, I've been working particularly with root lesion nematode only for a couple of years. Although research was done prior to 2009 involving teres, I think it's important for us to look at what we've been doing in our most recent history. So there's two particular field trials I want to point out. One was in 2009 into Katanning. This was a really big trial with teres, where we looked at 22 wheats, 21 barleys, 12 canolas, and we had 8 reps of each of those in that paddock. In 2011 and 12, we looked at both resistance and done our first tolerance trial at 2J. And this was a trial where in the first year we attempted to manipulate the numbers of nematodes on that paddock so we could get a high and a low. And then we could look at the difference in the yields to get a tolerance picture from that. And in the second year, last year, we planted 24 cultivars onto that plot at 2J, and we did make that comparison, and with 6 reps of each. So I'd just like to remind you here again, the difference between resistance and tolerance. Resistance is when you're looking at the effect of the nematode, the plant on the nematode. So when you have a susceptible plant, you will be allowing the nematode to increase greatly on that. A susceptible plant is anything that multiplies more to a greater value than 1 during an assessment period. So if you have a resistant plant, of course, you're actually going to be reducing the number of nematodes on your plant. Tolerance, on the other hand, is the effect of the nematode on plant growth. So this is where, if you have a tolerant plant, it may not affect your yield, even if you have high numbers. An intolerant plant, of course, will have a greater effect of, on the yield, maybe with lower numbers. It's important to realise here that if you're growing a tolerant crop, you may actually be increasing your nematode numbers, and this could affect you in your next crop or the crop after that. So when we looked at our research in Katanning, this was a really wet year, and they actually had flooding on this site. And looking at these results, you can see that hammered is a good word to describe what happened out on that paddock. Everything that we threw at it, teres loved. When you look at multiplication and a susceptible variety coming in at 1, we're looking at up to 16 times on some of these. Now, I don't want you to get too caught up here in looking at what varieties sit where in particular, because this is really the beginning of the story, and we are really just nutting out where the varieties sit on this resistance to susceptible states. You can see even our fallow had multiplication that was at quite a significant level, well, was at a significant level. Our fallow wasn't actually fallow, it was quite a weed trial instead. And you'll see that both wheats and barleys were both susceptible to a large extent. Canola, well, canola wasn't much better, the multiplication wasn't quite as high, but again we had huge increases in numbers of the nematodes across all the varieties that we looked at. So now looking at the trial that we had at 2J last year, as you can see the multiplication wasn't nearly as high, but there is significant multiplication across varieties at the paddock that we worked on. It did yield well. Across the board we had 4 tonnes per hectare. But it did have a lot less rainfall than it usually would across the season. And we are wondering if this is a nematode that likes wet conditions, if our multiplication was held up by having a drier season. You'll see again that we have this nice range from those varieties that are really quite susceptible to those that are really quite resistant. So this is good news. When we looked at tolerance, this was our first tolerance trial of this type, and so anything that I say here, please take with a grain of salt, because we have much more work to do. So out of the 24 varieties that we looked at, we definitely found large intolerance in 8 of those varieties. And some of these yield losses were really significant. I mean, we're talking about 24% yield loss for Emu Rock and Carnamar, 12 for Arano and 12 for Westonia. Kalingari also had yield losses in these sort of realms as well. Some of our other varieties did really well, which is good news too. Mace, which is quite an important one to talk about, and Wild Ketchum. Now, Wild Ketchum, I have to say, across both our field trials and our Glasshouse trials, and this goes not just in Western Australia, but right across the eastern states as well. Wild Ketchum can move from being really quite susceptible to really quite resistant. So with that one, I think we need to take that one with a little bit of, give it a little bit of leeway. So now looking at our Glasshouse. We run these trials, both, I have to say, with Neglectus and teres. I'm only talking about teres, but we do our work in both of these areas. We use a controlled environment, and now we're looking at wheat, barley, canola, field pea and lupins. And these are ongoing assessments where we're changing the varieties that we're looking at, depending on what's coming up, what's being grown in Western Australia, and the things that we consider to be important. In 2012, I'm just using this one as an example, we looked at 30 wheat varieties, and we have 6 reps for those varieties. In red, I just wanted to point out the columns in red here is because nematode numbers are inherently variable. So we decided to use some of the standards that we use for Neglectus, where we have an idea of which ones should be resistant and which ones should be susceptible. And really these did prove to be quite helpful when we're looking at teres. Now when we looked at, this is just two of the trials that we ran looking at a broader range of crops, lupins, field pea, canola, wheat and barley. You can see the good thing here to really note, and again I'll say don't take too much attention to what varieties are up there if you can actually read them. Lupins and field peas are at the good end of the scale. Canola sits more in the middle. Wheat and barley are much more susceptible. And barley may prove to be the most susceptible crop to Pratylenchus teres. So now we're starting to build that picture that's going to be most important to you guys. And it will take a lot more research for us to actually give you a really good idea of which cultivars are the best and which crops are the best. So this is really to be taken as the beginning of the picture that we're building. When we look at lupins, they are proving to be resistant, so that's really good news. Field peas and more resistant to moderately resistant. And then canola, barley and wheat then fall into that susceptible category where you have to be more careful about your crop rotation and certainly more careful about your varietal selection if you end up with an issue of Pratylenchus in these situations. So my key messages. I'll be very happy, I seem to be running a good time. Root Lesion Nematode itself is broadly distributed in Western Australia. I think it's been ignored to a large degree in recent years perhaps, and that may be our fault for not bringing it to your attention more often, because it is cryptic and you can ignore it. And if you're dealing with a yield loss or a production penalty that's sitting around 5%, you might not be actually seeing that in your crop. It's there, it's happening, and if you want to maximise your profitability, then you need to pay more attention to detail, I suppose. Teres itself is broadly distributed. It is a West Australian issue, and we want to do research to actually build a better picture, because when we are seeing it, it is a nasty one. You need to pay attention to your cultivars, and you need to pay attention to your crop rotations if it does prove that you have an ongoing issue with these nematodes in your paddocks. And I'd just like to say, lastly, of course, that we have been doing research in Western Australia. We have been doing really good research over a long period of time, and we hope to continue. Thank you.
Could you comment more about the acid soils and the trial work that's been done there?
We have done 2 Glasshouse experiments involving Chris Gazy. Both of those experiments, now we haven't done it on teres, this has been done on Neglectus. Both of those experiments show quite clearly that when you have an acid soil situation, that the resistance that we have, varietal resistance, is breaking down. So a more resistant variety, we're getting much higher numbers of nematodes on that in an acid soil. So this is really important stuff, and I do hope that we'll do more research on that.
When you say acid, how acid? What's the pH?
Chris gave us, we looked at paddocks that were in two situations. One was from Wongling Hills and the other was, can't remember, sorry. So it was soils from two areas that he's done research in. So we were looking at 4.32 was the low and 4.9 was the high. 4.1 was the low, 4.9 was the high. Sorry, I can't, numbers don't stick in my head very well. So we were looking at quite acid soils, and they were real life situations. Now, when I went to the national group meeting last week in Brisbane, and I showed some of that work because we're quite happy with it, and they were shocked at what we called acid soils. I mean, what we called wood soils, they were calling acid soils. So obviously our situation is very different.